So two of my favorite actors, Rhys and Tatiana Maslany, are going to be starring in a new adaptation of Perry Mason for HBO. So, I had to make a video about that. I haven't read Perry Mason in donkey's years, but I have some very fond memories of the series because when I was very young and reading inappropriately for my age, my local library had basically a wall full of Perry Mason mysteries. And it was a very exciting wall because they still had those really old covers. I don't know if the new reissued versions have those covers, but back in the day they had those really pulpy 1930s hard-boiled Penny Dreadful covers. And they always looked like books that my mother would take away from me if she ever found me reading them because they look kind of sleazy in a very pleasurable way. There was a woman with like a skimpy gown, and then there was some guy in a trench coat who was chasing her or something. I don't know if that's an actual description of an actual cover, but that's the kind of covers that they used to have. But the books themselves, if I remember correctly, they were pretty PG-rated content, false advertising at its finest. So for those of you who don't know, Perry Mason is this lawyer and he works in the shadier part of town, and he's sort of the last resort for people who can't find help from the usual sources. So it's usually people whom the police think are guilty or are the victims of a conspiracy or just generally can't find anyone to help them or establish their innocence, and then Perry Mason will take their case, and usually for like no other reason than he's interested in the case, so money's never an issue. And I always wonder about people like that, like how are they paying their rent? In the HBO series, I noticed that he's introduced as a detective, so I guess they're just going to focus on the detection part of it and ignore the courtroom aspect of it, which, if I remember correctly, was also a big part of the TV series adaptation from, I think, the 1950s or 60s. It's not a series that I really watched because it was way before my time and it wasn't the kind of thing that came on reruns in India. And when I moved to the States, there was just so much other stuff to watch that I never watched the Perry Mason series. But I do know that they are a classic, and perhaps that's where you first met Perry Mason as the character. I think of Perry Mason as an American classic. He was the sort of the American version of the Queens of Crime from Britain. If you don't know who that is, you should check out my video about Dorothy L. Sayers. Earl Stanley Gardner, who wrote the series, was a lawyer himself, and so he had like a really good knowledge of the law, and I think that's what he wanted to see in Perry Mason. He was a man with a great deal of respect for the law, and I think in the earlier novels he was a bit more shady, but as the novels go on and as the series kind of found its footing, I think he became more morally upright. And that's kind of what these books are like. They're really unobjectionable, If you took those covers away from my childhood copies of the books, I don't think my mother would have said anything about it. They're also really old school, they have these really old school titles like The Case of the Counterfeit Eye or The Case of the Rolling Bones. And sometimes he went for alliteration, so it was The Case of the Shoplifter's Shoe or The Case of the Moth-Eaten Mink. I love stuff like that. It's proper old school. They're also just really slim books, like they're not giant books because they're like, I think there's like more than 50 of these. That's a lot to write. And I don't think he was one of these people who are writing today, so he probably didn't have an army of assistants to help him with it. So that was him at his desk typing it all out. So they're not giant novels, they're not door stoppers. They're very easy to sort of read on a long commute or before bed. I like it when things are updated. I'm not one of those persons who are horrified by people adapting things to a different setting or a different aesthetic. So it doesn't really upset me that HBO is going in a slightly different direction from the novels that I remember. But if you're the kind of person who finds early 20th century American pop fiction charming, then Earl Stanley Gardner is basically somebody whom you can't afford to miss. It's not great literature or anything, but it is fun. Remember fun? I like fun. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.